On 13 April 1983, rail crews in Spanish Fork Canyon, Utah, found the main line track pushed out of alignment. 22 families were evacuated on 15 April. By 18 April, the town of Thistle was underwater, roofs still showing above a lake that had not existed a week earlier. 2 hours north, Bingham Canyon had been an incorporated Utah city since 1904. On maps for 67 years, home to as many as 15,000 people, no trace of it remains today. The federal government owns 64.4% of Utah, 35 million of 54.3 million acres, the second highest share in the country. Most of it has a history nobody is telling. 10 places made this list. We start at number 10, a canyon where the mountain is still moving, 40 years after it took the town at the bottom. Stay until number 3. In July 1970, the U.S. Army built a road across a foreign desert to dig something back out of the ground. What was inside it is at number 3. If you like the places America filed away and forgot, subscribe. Today, we are counting down 10 Utah places that water, money, and the federal government took apart. Number 10. Thistle, the town that drowned in 3 days. There is a signed pull-off on US 89 where the canyon opens, and from it you can see the whole thing at once. The walls are red-brown and steep, sagebrush and scattered juniper, the river running the floor beside the tracks. On the flat below there are foundations, a telephone pole, old fence lines, half a dozen roofless houses, and the shell of a 2-story schoolhouse, standing on dry ground at 5,043 feet. Above all of it, on the south wall, a pale scar about a mile long that has not healed in 40 years. Freight trains still come through. This is a working main line, and the sound takes a long time to come back down. Thistle was a railroad town. The Denver and Rio Grande Western needed a place in the canyon to add helper engines and water and service trains, and after the San Pete branch opened in 1890, the junction grew to about 600 people. Diesel killed the reason for the town long before the mountain did. The depot came down in 1972. The shops and post office closed in 1974. By March 1983, there were roughly 50 people left in a dozen houses. Then the winter of 1982 and 1983 loaded the canyon's clay slopes with record snow, and a fast spring drove that meltwater into the slope above the town. On 13 April, the rails moved. By 15 April, the highway was impassable, and the ground was rising about a foot an hour. Everyone was out by dawn. By 18 April, the slide was advancing 3 feet an hour. Here is the part people get wrong. The landslide did not bury Thistle. It dammed the river. The debris built an earthen wall roughly 220 feet high across the Spanish Fork, and the water backed up behind it, and the town died from the bottom up under a lake that was 4 days old. The bill came to more than $200 million, which made it the most expensive landslide in American history. The Denver to Salt Lake main line was cut for 3 months, at close to $1 million a day. Engineers drove 3 tunnels, and the trains ran again on 4 July 1983 through 3,000 feet of new bore under Billy's Mountain. The highways did not reopen until 30 December. Utah got its first presidential disaster declaration out of it, signed by Ronald Reagan. Nobody died. That is the strange arithmetic of Thistle. A town, a transcontinental railroad, and 2 U.S. highways destroyed, and not one funeral. You can walk it today. It is free, unmanaged, and the ground is still creeping, which is a polite way of saying the mountain has not finished. 22 families got a few hours of warning and the rest of their lives to explain where they used to live. Number 9. Topaz, Utah's 5th largest city, sold for parts. There is a thrift shop in Delta, Utah, at 350 West 100 South. Before it was a thrift shop, it was an American Legion Hall. Before that, an Oddfellows Hall. Before all of that, it was the pharmacy wing of a hospital in a prison camp 16 miles out in the desert. Topaz opened on 11 September 1942 and closed on 31 October 1945. The project covered 19,800 acres, but the part behind the barbed wire was exactly 640 acres, 1 square mile. On 17 March 1943, It held 8,130 people, which made it the fifth largest city in Utah. Nearly all of them came from the San Francisco Bay Area. 2/3 of them were American citizens by birth. The barracks were tar paper over wood frame, divided into rooms about 20 feet square, holding roughly 5 people each. And inside that square mile, people built a town, a newspaper, a literary journal, 2 libraries with nearly 7,000 items, an art school run by Kiyura Obata and Mine Okubo, a music school that peaked at 653 students. On the evening of 11 April 1943, James Hatsuaki Wakasa, a 63-year-old chef from San Francisco, was shot through the chest and killed by a military police sentry near the western fence. Within weeks, Issei laborers built a stone monument at the spot, using native rock and about a sack and a half of cement, without authorization. In June, the administration ordered it torn down. The stone stayed buried for 77 years. Archaeologists located it again in the autumn of 2020. On 27 July 2021, it was dug back out with construction equipment, without consulting the community, and it now sits in a museum courtyard while people argue about where it belongs. When the camp closed, the government sold it. The barracks went at auction. The pipes and utility poles went for scrap. And by 1947, the fifth largest city in Utah had been carted away in pieces. Dozens of those pieces are still standing around Delta as houses and sheds. The site itself became a National Historic Landmark on 29 March 2007. You can visit both. The camp is open, free, and self-guided. Cindered roads, foundations, guard tower footings, rock gardens, sections of fence. A city of 8,000 people is now a grid of low mounds in the alkali, and the most durable thing anyone built there is a shed in somebody's backyard. Number 8. Bingham Canyon, the town that voted itself out of existence. It had one street. That street was 7 miles long, because the canyon floor was barely wider than a road, and the town could only grow in one direction, so it grew lengthwise, with the houses stacked up the slopes above it. The Bingham family settled the canyon in August 1848 for grazing and timber. Ore turned up in 1863, the railroad arrived in 1873, and the city incorporated on 29 February 1904. At its peak in the 1920s, something like 15,000 people lived along that single road. By 1912, about 65% of them were foreign-born, and they sorted themselves camp by camp. Scandinavians at Carr Fork, Southern and Eastern Europeans at Highland Buoy, Greeks and Japanese at Copperfield, Welsh and Cornish at Lark. Somebody called it a literal League of Nations. Then the mine changed shape. Open pit work began in 1906, which made the mountain itself the ore body, and the pit started eating outward and downward through the ground the town stood on. It took the camps one at a time. Highland Buoy and Copperfield were closed out by 1960. Lark was gone by 1980. In November 1971, the 31 people still living in Bingham Canyon voted 11-2 to abolish their own city. The last buildings were razed the following year. The hole is still working. It is more than 3/4 of a mile deep and about 2.5 miles across, and it is generally described as the largest excavation human beings have ever made. On the night of 10 April 2013, the pit wall let go in 2 slides about 90 minutes apart, roughly 145 million tons of rock, which the Utah Geological Survey calls the largest mining-induced landslide in history. It destroyed 3 of the mine's 13 shovels and 14 of its 100 haul trucks, and set off a small earthquake. It killed nobody, because the monitoring saw it coming, and the pit had been cleared. You can look into it from an overlook, seasonally, by shuttle. What you cannot do is stand where the town was. There is a historical marker for Bingham Canyon. They had to put it down near the canyon mouth, on ground the mine had not gotten to yet. Number 7. Home of Truth. The woman who refused to bury the body. Marie Ogden's typewriter told her where to build. She was born in Newark, New Jersey, in 1883, and served as president of the New Jersey State Federation of Women's Clubs. Her husband Harry, an insurance executive, died of cancer in 1929. She turned to spiritualism and astrology. preached her way west, and by 1933, she was 49 and buying land in Dry Valley, San Juan County, Utah, because the messages coming through her typewriter said to. Her followers handed over their property and their savings and gave up meat, alcohol, tobacco, and coffee. The colony was laid out in 3 portals running west from the highway. The middle portal had a cobblestone chapel whose foundation was never finished. The inner portal, where Ogden lived, sat on what she said was the exact center of the Earth's axis. At its peak, around 1934 and 1935, about 100 people lived there, waiting for an apocalypse that this valley alone would survive. On 11 February 1935, a member named Edith Peshak died of cancer. Ogden announced that she was not dead but between worlds, and had the body given salt solution baths and milk and egg feedings several times a day. In that dry air, it mummified. The county sheriff asked to see the body and was refused. Utah's attorney general sent the county attorney, who was also refused. A local physician, Dr. I.W. Allen, was eventually admitted with 2 nurses and ruled the remains no health hazard. That August, the body was quietly cremated on a pyre of cedar, pine, and juniper. A death certificate was not signed until 4 May 1937. Here is the wild part. In May 1934, before any of this broke, Ogden had bought the San Juan Record, the only newspaper in the county. So when reporters from Chicago and Los Angeles came for the story of the mummified woman in the Utah desert, the local paper covering it was edited by her. She kept it for 15 years and ran a metaphysics column in it. Most of the colony was gone by the end of 1937. About 7 people stayed. The buildings are still visible from the highway, on private land, and 1 restored portal building is rented out for the night. Marie Ogden lived in San Juan County almost 40 more years, teaching piano, and died in 1975 at 91. She is buried in the Monticello Cemetery, in the ground, the ordinary way. Number 6. Iosepa, the Hawaiian town in the salt desert. There is a fire hydrant standing by itself in the sagebrush in Skull Valley, Utah. Nothing is attached to it. Nothing is near it. It is the last working piece of a water system built in 1908 by a town of native Hawaiians in the middle of the West Desert. On 28 August 1889, 46 settlers arrived and drew lots for land. They were Pacific Islander converts who had gathered to Salt Lake City through the 1880s to be near the temple and found a city where they did not speak the language, met open prejudice, and, once leprosy appeared among them, were treated as a public health problem. So a separate colony was arranged, and a Hawaiian committee chose the 1,920-acre rich ranch in Skull Valley, a hot, barely watered basin under the Stansbury Mountains, about as far from the tropical Pacific as North America gets. They named it Iosepa, the Hawaiian form of Joseph, for the church leader Joseph F. Smith, who had served as a missionary in the islands. And they made it work. They piped mountain water through cement-bottom ditches to every street and lot, with fire hydrants, which was an unusual thing for a rural Utah town to have in 1908. They named the streets Honolulu and Kula. They planted poplars and yellow roses. They ran their own script at the store, kept Hawaiian as the working language, and won a state prize as the best-kept town in Utah. The population peaked at 228. Then, in 1915, Joseph F. Smith announced a temple at Laia in Hawaii. The entire reason the colony existed, being close to a temple, had just moved to the islands. The church paid passage for anyone who could not afford it. By January 1917, Iosepa was a ghost town, and the ranch was sold. The cemetery went onto the National Register in 1971 and holds at least 79 graves. The first, on 15 September 1889, was an elderly woman named Maka Opiopio, who had arrived 3 weeks earlier and died of leprosy. On the centennial in 1989, a monument went up, a granite shaft with a bronze Polynesian warrior, and a time capsule to be opened in 2040, 2065, 2090, and 2115. 364 days a year, that valley is wind and greasewood and meadowlarks, On the other one, Memorial Day weekend, about 1,000 people show up with ukuleles and an IMU pit and camp on the ground their families left in 1917. If you are finding this interesting, drop a thumbs up and tell me in the comments which of these 6 you had never heard of. I read them. Number 3 is still ahead, the one I mentioned at the start. Number 5, Widtsoe, the town the government bought and took away. Widtsoe was a bet that it would rain. Around 1908, settlers moved into Johns Valley at 7,605 feet, a high sagebrush basin northeast of what is now Bryce Canyon, with no dependable irrigation water. They dry farmed it. Plant deep, work the soil to hold moisture, trust the weather. The town could not settle on a name. It was Adairville, then Houston, then Winder, and in 1917 it took the name Widtsoe, after the agricultural scientist whose methods the whole valley was standing on. For a decade the bet paid. By 1912, there was a post office, sawmills, a confectionery plant, 2 hotels, 4 stores, and a church. Running water arrived in 1915. The Forest Service put a district office there. In the summer of 1920, the rain stopped. It turned out Johns Valley ran on something like a 20-year cycle of wet and dry, and nobody had built that into the plan. The dry half arrived with the Depression attached. By 1930, there were 210 people. By 1935, there were 17 families sitting on mortgaged, tax-delinquent land that nobody would buy at any price. So the Federal Resettlement Administration bought all of it, every landholding. It moved the families to better farmland elsewhere in Utah, tore most of the buildings down, and placed more than 26,000 acres under the Taylor Grazing Act as public range. The last residents were gone by 1937. What is left is a leaning schoolhouse that doubled as the church, a few frame houses, collapsing log cabins, root cellars dug into the ground, and a cemetery in a stand of pinyon pines that people kept using into the 1990s. Which is the thing about Widtsoe. It was demolished and its people were scattered on purpose, and it still would not stay dead. The 1987 reunion drew 3 times as many people as had actually left in 1937. Number 4, Grafton, the town the river beat and Hollywood bought. If you have seen Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, you have seen Grafton. The bicycle scene was shot there in 1969. The bull in that sequence was a Hereford named Bill, and Paul Newman told the Salt Lake Tribune afterwards that he was a good bull, real sweet. The town under all that took 85 years to lose. 5 families settled it in December 1859 on the south bank of the Virgin River, below what is now Zion National Park, as part of Brigham Young's cotton mission. In January 1862, the Virgin ran for weeks and erased it, along with 3 neighboring settlements. The survivors moved a mile upstream and rebuilt. The river never let up. Diversion dams washed out 2 and 3 times in a single year. The silt load meant the irrigation ditches had to be dredged weekly. Farms ran to about an acre a family. By the 1864 church census, the town had reached 168 people in 28 families, and that was as big as it ever got. Then the Black Hawk War. On 2 April 1866, Robert Berry, his wife Isabella, and Joseph Berry were killed near Short Creek and buried in the Grafton Cemetery. The town evacuated to Rockville and walked back every day to tend the crops. People left for better land. 4 families by 1890, 3 by 1920. The last residents drove out in the mid-1940s, and 2 years later, a Hollywood producer named Harry Sherman bought the town site, which is the only reason anything survived. 5 buildings still stand out of more than 30, including the 2-story adobe schoolhouse from 1886, built with lumber hauled 75 miles from Mount Trumbull. Since 1997, a heritage partnership has restored them and bought about 150 acres around the town to keep it in hay. Zion is minutes away and gets millions of visitors. Grafton gets the wind in the cottonwoods, and a cemetery full of people who kept rebuilding in the same floodplain. Number 3, Green River, the melon town that missed. This is the one I told you to stay for. Green River, Utah, is famous for melons. It has thrown a melon festival every September since 1906. It is less famous for the 244 missiles the U.S. Army fired out of the desert just south of town between 1964 and 1975. The complex was a detached firing range for white sands. The idea was efficient and slightly absurd. Launch from Utah and let the missiles arc roughly 450 miles south over the Four Corners onto the range in New Mexico. 141 were Athena re-entry test rockets, 50 feet tall, 16,000 pounds, going 200 miles up and coming back down at 15,000 miles an hour. 60 more were Pershings. The town's population roughly doubled to almost 2,000 people. On 11 July 1970, Athena number 122 lifted off, and its fourth-stage motor did something it was not supposed to do. The vehicle overflew White Sands entirely. It overflew New Mexico. It kept going south and buried itself in the Mapimi Desert in the state of Durango, Mexico, about 450 miles past the point it was aimed at. So here is what was inside it, and here is why the Army built a road across a foreign desert to get it back. 2 small containers of cobalt-57, a radioactive isotope embedded in tungsten. The recovery was called Operation Sand Patch. It ran from 23 September to 7 October 1970, cost $104,000, and removed 60 drums of contaminated soil, plus 3 more of protective clothing. Henry Kissinger wrote to President Nixon about it and blamed abnormal re-entry into the atmosphere. What people in Durango saw was a sealed-off desert, Americans in protective gear, and a road cut to nowhere. That is the documented origin of the Mapimi Zone of Silence, a UFO legend and a tourist draw ever since. Durango got a story it has been selling for 50 years. Green River is down to 847 people and still has the melons. Number 2. Cisco, the town that died of diesel. Cisco existed because steam engines get thirsty. In the 1880s, the Denver and Rio Grande Western needed somewhere on the flats below the Book Cliffs to top off boilers, so it built a water station and a saloon and pumped water up from the Colorado River. A town accumulated around the tank. By 1900, it was one of the region's great sheep-shearing yards, moving over 100,000 head a season. Oil and gas turned up nearby in 1924. Then 2 things killed it, and neither of them was a disaster. The railroad switched to diesel, which does not stop for water, and Interstate 70 was built 5 miles north, taking the highway traffic with it. What was left was such a good ruin that filmmakers kept coming back. Vanishing Point in 1971, Thelma and Louise in 1991, Don't Come Knocking in 2005. In 2015, an artist named Eileen Musa bought a piece of Cisco with her savings, an amount she compared to what someone with a good job spends on a vacation, and became its only year-round resident. She restored a 1923 log cabin and the one-room post office, built painted campers out of scavenged material, and in 2019 opened an artist residency. She listed the property in June 2024 after years of harassment from a neighbor. A Moab woman named Kara Bard bought it that December and is starting the residency up again. The 2020 census counted 4 people in Cisco, a town that 2 technologies rendered pointless, and people keep buying it anyway. Number 1. Hole N, The Rock. The house one man dug out of a cliff and never finished. There is a stuffed donkey named Harry standing inside a cliff 12 miles south of Moab. He was the family pet. He is still on the tour. Around 1940, a miner named Albert Christensen started chipping a shelter into a sandstone bluff beside US 191. It began as an alcove. He worked at it for 12 years and took 50,000 cubic feet of rock out of that cliff, leaving the big pillars standing where he needed them to hold the ceiling up. What he ended up with was 5,000 square feet and 14 rooms inside solid stone. He kept going after that. He drilled a 65-foot chimney straight up through the rock so the fireplace would draw. He cut a bathtub out of the wall. He painted a life-size Sermon on the Mount. He carved Franklin Roosevelt's head into the cliff face near the door and painted the name across the rock in white letters 20 feet tall. He and Gladys opened a diner in the front room in 1945 to catch the uranium traffic. They moved in properly in 1952. Albert had a heart attack in 1955 and died in 1957, with the house unfinished, so Gladys finished it a different way. She kept the cafe and the gift shop, and she walked strangers through her husband's half-built cave, room by room, past the 2 stuffed horses and the donkey, for 17 years, until she died in 1974. It is open 7 days a week, 9 to 5, 12-minute tours, about 500 people a day. Owners bought it in 2000 and kept it as it was. Outside there are camels and peacocks and rusted tool sculptures. Inside, it stays around 70 degrees no matter what the desert is doing, and everything is more or less where the Christians left it. They are both buried in a little alcove in the rock, a few yards from the front door. 500 people a day walk past those 2 graves to look at a house a man ran out of time on. Gladys made sure they would. This list started in a canyon that swallowed a town and ended at a donkey in a cave, which is about the range Utah offers. For me, it is Iosepa, a fire hydrant alone in the sagebrush, put there by people from the Pacific who built a town in a salt desert and won a prize for keeping it tidy. That one stays with me. Which of these had you never heard of, and which Utah place did we miss? If this kind of forgotten American history is what you are after, subscribe.